Well, hey, good morning, everybody. Yeah, good to see you. Glad you're here. So, I had something happen to me recently. It was such a simple moment in life, and yet it was deeply, deeply profound. I was on vacation with my family a few weeks ago, and we were in New Jersey. Now, if you're anything like me, when I get on vacation, I like to slow down to kind of like set the pace on like reverse gear almost and procrastinate anything possible. And we were at a point in the week where I had put off getting gas in our vehicle for almost far too long, right? The little thing on the dashboard said that I had less than 20 miles available. So at this point, I needed to pull in and get gas. And so I did just that, right? And we were in the state of New Jersey, and if you have ever been there, it's actually illegal to get out and pump your own gas. It's kind of nice, but if you don't know that, it's also kind of weird, right? I knew this, so heads up if you're going to New Jersey anytime soon. I rolled the window down and I leaned out, I said, fill her up on 87. That's gas station talk in case you ever have to do that, right? Just another healthy tip, right? And the gentleman kept coming closer to me, and rather than just stop and start filling me up, right? He came closer to me, and when I looked at the window and I saw him, I stopped and paused for a second because this is what he was wearing in that moment. He was wearing a hat that said, "I love Jesus." Now, you may love that sort of thing. For me, that creates a reaction inside of me that almost makes me cringe, to be honest with you. I grew up in the 90s where there was this revolution of Christian t-shirts. Some of you remember this, right? Where we took the Budweiser logo and said Blood Wiser and thought we were being like really clever. God's Gym, do you remember that sort of stuff? And I grew up in this sort of tension where I'm like, I don't know if that really is communicating who we want to be, and I tried not to get involved in that kind of stuff. So it just brought me back into this moment, in this memory, but I sort of pushed past it and didn't pass judgment on him. And I looked at him and I said, hey, I like your hat. Like I thought I was being the big person here, right? And the dude at that moment, at the mention of his hat, he lit up like a Christmas tree. I mean, his smile went from ear to ear, and he got so excited and started talking to me about the guy named Jesus that he loves. Started talking to me about God, and he was so excited, and his joy was just beyond evident, more than anything I probably have ever experienced in my life. And he looked at me and goes like this, and he runs back to the attendant, the little glass area where he collects money, and he comes back with a poster, and he starts telling me about scripture in Job that points to the names of the constellations in heaven, right? And as we're talking, I mean, the dude is just lighting up, and he goes, what's your name? And I said, David. He goes, that's the name of a king. And I'm like, yes, I love you. We're best friends now, right? And I'm like, well, what's your name? And he goes, my name is Marcus, but I go by Mark because that's, a name of the book of the Bible and an author of one of the Gospels. And we had this dynamic, beautiful exchange. But, filling up on gas doesn't last very long, right? And so he ended, I gave him a credit card, and as he came back with my receipt, I had my wallet on my lap, and I looked down, and there was a $10 bill in my wallet. And I felt like I need to tip Mark. And so I gave him a $10 bill. And as I'm watching in the side view mirror right out my window, he walks away and just starts erupting in praise. Like starts screaming at the top of his lungs, thank you, God, thank you, Jesus. And I think he did like one of those kick things where he just jumped, and he was so excited. And the reason I tell you it was a $10 tip was because his reaction didn't match what I thought a $10 tip was worth. He had a lottery type reaction, just going crazy, right? And as he's screaming and walking away, my family and I are driving away, and we are in complete silence for about 4 miles up until the freeway. And here's what I realized. Here we are in the middle of vacation where everyone is experiencing the beach and dinner and what seems to be luxury. And yet the most joyful person I encountered in that whole trip was pumping gas. Somehow, some way, Mark didn't allow his position to determine his posture. Amen. 2 weeks ago, Pastor Kent taught us about David, and he really put on display for us some of the different positions that we experience in life. And he did a fantastic job talking about the pasture and the palace. But what I want to talk about today is our posture that we can assume despite our position. So when we jump back into the scriptures and we're in 1 Samuel chapter 20, I want to catch us up with where we are. And to no surprise, if you know the story of David as the king, before he became king, he was running for his life. And in 1 Samuel chapter 20, what happened in the previous chapter is Saul, the mad king, had declared officially that he was going to kill David. And he was out hunting for him, and he wanted to kill him, right? And this was the kind of hunt that really should put David on high alert, right? Because there was no consequence for Saul if he carried out this action. Like, he was allowed to do what he wanted to do as king, right? But thankfully, Jonathan, Saul's son, David's close friend, spoke up on David's behalf, advocated for him, and talked Saul down out of that moment. But it didn't last very long. Saul's vengeance and anger heats up again. And here we are in chapter 20 with David on the run, once again, fearing for his life from King Saul. In verse 1, here's what it says. Then David fled from Naioth in Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, the king's son, what have I done? What is my guilt and what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life? David's pouring his heart out as he's running for his life. He wants to find answers and figure out, why am I in this situation? And he, being Jonathan, said to him, far from it. You shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing either great or small without disclosing it to me. And why should my father hide this one from me, right? It is not so. Jonathan is confident because he remembered what he just did. He believes, I can talk my dad out of this one. My dad might seem crazy to you, but I have his ear. Don't worry, David. I'll put in a good word. We'll be back in the palace in no time. But David's not buying it this time, is he? In verse 3, it goes on, but David vowed again. And that word vowed there shows great emotion in this moment. It communicates to us that David was pushing beyond just a normal conversation, and he was operating at that heart level where he was being incredibly vulnerable and pushing further to disagree with the king's son. Your father knows well that I have found favor in your eyes. And he thinks, do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death. Now we can't brush over this moment and this response for David, because David is actually pushing back on the king's son. You do not do that with royalty in this day and age. See, today we can say whatever we want. We can have an opinion. We can disagree. We can post it anywhere we want. And there really aren't necessarily consequences for doing that. But back then, this was grounds for death. Because Jonathan was royalty. But something inside of David caused him to be vulnerable, caused him to push further, caused him to believe that he could trust and find refuge in Jonathan. Verse 4 says this, then Jonathan said to David, whatever you say, I will do for you. See, what Jonathan does is he returns risk with risk because he chooses the side with his father's enemy. He chooses this posture that doesn't necessarily make sense. So the two of them devise a plan, and what they're going to do is have David skip out on the upcoming New Moon Festival. That was a festival where everyone would be at the table who was a part of Saul's court. They would be eating with Saul and celebrating feast style this new moon moment in their calendar, right? But David was going to skip out on it, and Jonathan's job was to go and figure out what were Saul's intentions. Was his anger still burning, or did he cool off, and was it safe for David? And one of the things I love about Jonathan is that he devised this plan to figure out carefully and cleverly how to take care of David, his close friend. You see, what he was going to do was he was going to find out the news from Saul, and then he was going to go out and determine a place where David could hide, and Jonathan was going to shoot arrows and give a signal to David about if it was safe or not. So Jonathan goes to the feast, he goes to the festival, and day one passes, not a word is mentioned about David. Day two comes, and Saul's anger rages. He hasn't changed. Things aren't good for David any longer. Matter of fact, Saul got so angry, he actually chucked the spear at his son Jonathan in that moment. And so on the third day, Jonathan goes out. He signals to David by shooting an arrow beyond the rocks where David is hiding, and he sends his armor bearer, a boy, with him to get the arrow. This was a way of communicating without anyone knowing the message, just in case there were people passing by. So we pick up this story in verse 40. And Jonathan gave his weapons to his boy and said to him, go and carry them to the city. Because apparently there was no one now around, and it was safe to have a conversation quickly with David. And as soon as the boy had gone, David rose from beside the stone heap and fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times. Here again is that sacred space of refuge, of friendship, of soul connection between Jonathan and David. And they kissed one another and wept with one another, David weeping the most. Then Jonathan said to David, go in peace, because we have sworn, both of us, in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord shall be between me and you, and between my offspring and your offspring forever. And he rose and departed, and Jonathan went to the city. Now, when you step back and peek at 1 Samuel chapter 20, what you see are two people who are friends, but they're in very different positions, aren't they? I mean, Jonathan is, despite the spear being thrown at him by his dad, he's still number two. He's still the king's heir. And in the next chapters in this book, 1 Samuel, Jonathan is going to be beside his father in battle, the palace position. He's still in a good spot, but David, he's back in the pasture. David's at a spot where he, again, is running for his life. And to me, when I look at this friendship, I see two people who are in differing positions, and it just doesn't make sense to me. Does it to you? I mean, if you were David, why would you be so vulnerable with Jonathan? I mean, isn't he your competition? Isn't he the guy that could tell Saul where you are so he could finish you off, and then Jonathan eventually could be king, right? And could you imagine what was going through David's mind when he shared this stuff with Jonathan, being vulnerable, expressing that he's afraid and he's running for his life? You know, they used to chant these incredible legacy stories about David and how he killed Goliath and he killed tens of thousands, but now he's running from Saul? Could you imagine what that would do to his reputation? Like, to me, it doesn't make any sense at all to speak to Jonathan this moment. If that's me, I'm out. I'm running. And the same is true for Jonathan. Why would you give away your future? Wealth, position, status, power, whatever you want. Why would you side with David? See, from the outside looking in, this friendship, this moment, this communication and conversation doesn't make sense. But the reality is they weren't like normal people, were they? Matter of fact, they were a lot more like the gas attendant named Mark. They didn't allow their position to affect their posture. See, to me, the only thing that bridges a gap between different positions in life is love. Love's the only thing that causes us to do what doesn't seem to make sense. Love's the thing that causes us to forgive, to stay longer, to understand, to listen, to turn back around and return. See, when I look at David and when I look at Jonathan, what I see isn't a typical posture. You know, so many times if you and I have grown up in church, and maybe you were a part of Sunday school like I was, I remember lessons about David and Jonathan, right? I remember thinking about, what a dynamic friendship. And I saw them on the little felt board, right, David and Jonathan. And I remember picturing that, thinking, I want to have a Jonathan friendship in my life. I want a place of refuge. I want to be a David to someone else. And deep within all of us, don't we all desire that type of connection? Don't we all long to have those friends of the heart who will look at us and say, whatever you need, I'll do? Don't you desire to have someone in your life who is completely open and vulnerable with you, who's willing to trust you and be known to you so that you can respond well to them? I think about this, and I imagine it's not like we don't know that David and Jonathan were good friends. We've got a lot of knowledge about David and Jonathan. We know what they did. We know how the story goes. And we have this deep desire to be friends and experience that type of connection. So why don't we have it? Why don't we have deep friends of the heart anymore? We've got followers, we've got friends on Facebook, we've got people who are in a similar position to us in life at work, or maybe coaching a team with us. We got people that we connect with and laugh with, but where are our friends of the heart? Friends where it doesn't necessarily make sense, but it's incredibly beautiful, the way they respond to one another. You know, today, modern world has brought us incredible technology and advancement. You and I are literally just a step away from connecting with anyone, anywhere, at any time in this world. We can email, we can phone call, we can social media connect, we can do anything we want and connect with anyone, right? Did you know this, that 95% of Americans have cell phones? 95%. I'm not a statistician, but people say that's a big number. That's a lot of people, right? Like we don't lack for connection in this world. We don't lack for opportunities and tools to connect with one another. But why are we known today as the most connected, disconnected generation ever? That's on us. That's the state that we exist in. Did you know that social scientists say that loneliness or a lack of belonging, a lack of refuge, is the next great health epidemic we're going to battle in this world? They put it on par with substance abuse and obesity. These are the two great crises that we're already battling, and loneliness is next. That's why understanding David and Jonathan and what was different about them matters so much. That's why thinking more about our posture than our position is so important for you and for me and for our kids as well. See, what I think is different about David and Jonathan, I think they were being willing and able to just risk it all and consider a different path. They didn't look at each other and figure like based on my position, how should I talk to you? Well, I'm the dad, and so this is what I'm supposed to say. This is what my dad, when he was in the position, this is what he said. So son, here's how I'm going to talk to you. Or I work here with you. You're my boss, and so I'm supposed to not like you. I'm supposed to think you're irrelevant, right? Most times we approach relationships and determine how we're going to act and talk based on our position. But what if we thought differently and acted like David and Jonathan and thought more about our posture? You see, at the heartbeat of their relationship, I think was a single question. It was this idea that guided the way they behaved and talked and decided how to move forward. It was a question that says, what does love require of me in this situation? They didn't worry about wealth or future or anointing or anything like that. They worried about love. They worried about each other's well-being. They thought, based on this moment, what is love asking me to do? There's a leadership adage that we use and follow all the time when it comes to our money, when it comes to our health and dieting and eating, when it comes to working out, when it comes to training for sport, when it comes to excelling in business and in career, really in any area of life. We see this sort of as that underlying message behind every commercial selling us a product. The phrase goes like this: if you and I want what normal people have, just do what normal people do. But if we want what few people have, we have to be willing to do what few people do. Meaning friendships like Jonathan and David, these friends of the heart, these places of refuge, they don't just happen by accident. They take work. They take intentionality. They take risk. They take an effort and a willingness to try a different path, to not think about position and worry more about posture. What if we would try it? What if you would approach your marriage that way? Not worrying about position and who's right and who's wrong and who did what last time, but simply saying, okay, based on what we're facing right now, what's love asking me to do? Kids, what if you approached your parents that way? What if you just didn't think and worry about how your other friends approach your parents and view them just as like not knowing anything anymore and just people who have it out for you? But what if you would pause and consider the question, well, what's love asking me to do here? How deep could our friendships go? Could we potentially move beyond a disconnected nature and actually have real, meaningful soul connection? What if we brought this to our workplaces? What if we pushed the org chart aside and didn't think about position but worried more about posture? What kind of revolution could happen then? How about our neighborhoods? How about with our parents, adults? What if we stopped thinking we knew everything? What if we stopped believing the lie that they don't really understand us anymore? And what if we just started thinking about the posture, what does love require of me in this moment? What if, right? You know, here's the deal. I want to pull out from David and Jonathan two things that I really believe in every situation, relationally speaking, love requires of us. But the reality is, we already know what love requires of us. Come on. We don't have to search for that answer, do we? We know. Sometimes we act confused. Sometimes we act like, well, I'm not sure what to do, and we go and process it, and we seek counsel. But the reality is, deep down in our hearts, the way we're wired, we already know the answer to this question. The challenge is, are we willing to be like the few? See, when I look at this story, here's the first thing that pops out, that I believe love always requires of in any single relationship. And I see this so clearly from David in the way he postured himself toward Jonathan, his competition for the throne. I think love always requires vulnerability. Always. Being known. Lowering the guard. Taking the filter down. Stop giving the safe answers, the coded answers that sort of say like, well, we're not perfect, but everything's okay, when you're really just a mess. Right? Really just letting people in. See, what I see in David in this moment is honest, raw, authentic David. He's afraid. He's doubting. He doesn't even believe what Jonathan just said about his father, and he was so willing to be vulnerable that he risked it all, even death, by pushing back on Jonathan and challenging his perspective. Vulnerability is what's missing in so many of our relationships because we're afraid of it, aren't we? Men, come on, when I said the word vulnerability, you sort of shuddered inside, didn't you? That's not a word we like, is it? It feels weak. It feels like a loss of control. It feels like, well, what's going to happen? Are they just going to reject me? And I remember the last time I did, so the rest of my life, I just built these walls and I didn't let anyone in. That way I could never get hurt again, but you can also never be loved again. You see, deep down, the desire of all of our hearts is to be loved, isn't it? We want to connect, we want to belong, and we want to experience what David and Jonathan experienced. But the reality is, you and I, we can only be loved to the extent that we're known. I can't love what I don't know. And for some of us, we have to stop waiting for everyone else to begin to build a bridge of trust. And we have got to make the first move. We've got to be willing to go out on a limb and take a shot and posture ourselves more so than position ourselves. What if, right? Brene Brown is a thought leader when it comes to this idea of social connection. Some of you may know her name. Some of you may have read her books. Maybe even perhaps you saw her talk on the TED Talks website, right? More than 6 million people have watched her work and her sort of groundbreaking, revolutionary discoveries about social connection. What she did is she took time, and she took actually some years to interview thousands and thousands of people who were in meaningful relationships, and she wanted to discover what's at the heartbeat and what is going on. And as she did the interviews and as she poured through the data, here's what she found as the normal situation for all of us. Here's what she found going on. She says, a deep sense of love and belonging is an irreducible need of all people. Isn't that true? At the end of the day, don't we all have a deep need to be loved? She said, we're biologically, cognitively, physically, and spiritually wired to love, to be loved, and to belong. And when those needs are not met, we don't function as we're meant to. We break, we fall apart, we numb, we ache, we hurt others, we get sick. You see, when we're connected but disconnected, bad things happen. And what Brene found as she poured through the research and looked at interview after interview after interview, the core and key for social connection, get this, is vulnerability, being known. Taking a risk. Trying to figure out what love requires of you in that situation. You see, one of the most loving things that we can ever do in our lives and in our relationships is let people see what's going on. It communicates trust and value and worth to them. Here's what Brene Brown says further. True belonging only happens when we present our authentic, imperfect selves to the world. Vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. And if we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path. She points out what David and Jonathan modeled through all of her research. And even more than Brene Brown, the Apostle Paul, as he writes in 2 Corinthians, as he starts to describe a struggle that he experienced, a thorn in his flesh, this thing that he didn't want to have a part of him any longer, and he's pleading with God to take it away. As he writes in this letter and he expresses and is vulnerable and admits that he's not perfect, that he's riding the struggle bus too, like all of us, right? This is where Paul finds himself, and as he writes in 2 Corinthians, he's asking God to take it away, and here's what he says in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9, "But he, being God, said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.'" That's not normal, is it? That's what so few people are willing to believe. "Therefore," this is Paul again, "I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Vulnerability is not weakness, it is strength. So where have you been holding back? Where have you been hiding? Where have you been given half-truths, and where have you been unwilling to be known? What if you could push further? What could happen in that relationship? Here's the second thing I think love always requires of us, and I see this in Jonathan. Love always requires that we listen longer. Always. Not that we listen and try to figure out how best to respond and get you to see my perspective. Nope. That we listen longer, that we linger, that we sit in the moment, that we take our time, that we put our cell phones away from the moment and we connect and we understand and we seek deeply to figure out what you're feeling, not long greatly just to tell you what I think. See, I think between verse 3 and 4, as David pushes back on Jonathan, and then in verse 4 it says, "Then he said," referring to Jonathan, I don't think that was a quick moment. I don't think these first 4 verses in 1 Samuel 20 happened at an argument-paced style. I think they happened at a deep, honoring, reflective pace. You see, when you and I are willing to listen longer, what we're doing is we're learning to move at the pace of love, not the pace of life. How much more honoring can we be than that, than to listen well, than to deeply connect, than to communicate that you matter more than everything that I want you to know or that I want to say? Maybe we're not as right as we think we are. Maybe we don't understand everything we assume to know. You see, how can we love if we do not know? And you and I, we can only love to the extent that we know. Love always requires that we linger and listen longer. You know, the Chinese language is really, really fascinating when you study it and start to peek at how it operates and how it works. And the character for listening is actually a combination of 4 or 5 other characters, and it really embodies what listening longer means for us. It means it's intentional. It means it's more than just a biological process of sound waves hitting our eardrum. It means it requires focus. It means it requires our eyes and our hearts and our presence. It means it doesn't just happen. We've got to be willing, like Jonathan was, to stop, to reconsider, and respond by saying, "Whatever you say, I'll do." Do you have one of those in your life? Are you one of those people to someone else in your life? Look, I'm not talking about being vulnerable and listening longer to the entire world. I'm not talking about like, hey, air your dirty laundry and let the whole world know. But I am talking about those sacred spaces that you know exist and that should be David and Jonathan type friendships that aren't yet. What does love require of you? You know, I'm curious, so many times as a pastor, working on staff at a church and previously at a different church, sometimes I wonder why we all come on Sunday mornings. Like, why are we all here? Are we hoping to maybe come and hang out for an hour and meet some people? Or maybe pick up on a couple of healthy tidbits to maybe just have a little bit better life, or maybe figure out how to make Monday through Friday easier? Is that deep down behind our minds and our hearts? Is that our intent? You see, that what makes me think this kind of a questioning thought, and I'm not saying that of anyone, please only hear what I'm saying, right? Author Bob Goff said this in his book that he recently released. You know, it's called Everybody Always. He said this: our problem following Jesus is we're trying to be a better version of us rather than a more accurate reflection of him. See, bigger than just deeper friendships, this idea of posturing ourselves more than positioning ourselves and asking the question, what does love require of me? That is exactly the path that Jesus himself walked. And even more so than our friendships, if you have friends of the heart and you are a place of refuge and you're good with all of this stuff, the idea of listening longer and being more vulnerable and being willing to do what so few are willing to do puts us closer and closer on the path to following Jesus, because that's exactly what he did. He left heaven. He's God. He had it good. Everything was great up there, but he willingly came and became a man. He became his creation and walked among us for 30 plus years. And what he did was he lived a perfect life, and yet he took on all of our sin and he died. How much more vulnerable can you be than that? That's completely lowering the filter and taking it all on and saying, I love you. And I imagine as I look at every one of Jesus' interactions, he was never in a rush. He had purpose, but he had the right pace. And he walked slowly through the crowd, and he listened longer, and he identified with everything that you and I feel and experience and think. He was fully human. He even knows what temptation is like, because he listened long to our lives and our experiences and our perspective. You see, this is bigger than just great friendships. It's about the reflection of Jesus himself. So may we all be willing to think more about posture than position. May we all be willing to give vulnerability and listening longer a shot. May we be willing in our relationships to simply ask one question: what does love require of me? And somehow, some way, may the world watch all of this and grow deeper and deeper in their curiosity about our God. Could we bow our heads and pray today? Father, thanks so much for what we experience as we engage your word. Jesus, you showed us an incredible path. It's not an easy path, but it's the best path. And Father, I pray that you would grant us the courage to push back any of our fears and any of our observations or any of our thoughts or any of our past history and really step into this life you've designed for us. God, grant us David and Jonathan moments as we're willing to change our posture no matter our position, Lord. Father, thank you again always for showing us a better way. May we be counted among the few. May we not just experience and chase a normal life, but the fullest life of all. Father, convict us where we're off the right path and show us the better way. We love you and give this all and do this all for you. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.